We continue now at the top of Daf Novam Aleph and Meseches Avodah Zara. This is Avodah Zarah Daf 56a. On the previous summit, the Gemara was discussing when is wine considered to be wine in terms of the halacha of yayin nesach. And the Mishnah said that wine is considered to be wine from the time that it actually reaches the bore, the pit. First, the wine starts out in the wine press. It then runs through a pipe, through a strainer, and eventually makes its way to the bore, to the pit. And so again, in the Mishnah, it said that only when it actually reaches the pit is it considered to be wine in terms of the halachos of yayin nesach. And the Gemara in the previous summit cited the opinion of Rav Huna that actually even in the wine press it's considered to be wine as far as yayin nesach is concerned once it begins to flow. And the Gemara in the previous summit answered by saying that there was actually a Mishnah Rishona and a Mishnah Achrona. There was a first version and a second version. The first version is like our Mishnah, that's only when it reaches the pit that it's considered to be wine. But in the second version, again, even when it already starts flowing from the wine press, it's considered to be wine as far as yayin nesach is concerned. And the Gemara now continues bringing the Bryce of the Mishnah Achrona, the second Mishnah, which has some other differences between the second Mishnah and the first Mishnah, as the Bryce now continues, Ve'ein botzrim Yisrael, sha'osa peirosa b'tumah. You're not allowed to harvest with a Jew if the Jew deals with his fruits. The Jew deals with his produce b'tumah in impurity. V'kol shekein shein dorchen, and certainly you shouldn't tread with the Yisrael who does that. But the Brisa continues and says, Aval botzrin im ha'ovet kochavim begas. We are allowed to harvest with the ovet kochavim, with the idolater in the wine press. Shemuter ligrom tumah l'chulin sheberetz Yisrael. Because in this version, in the Mishnah Achrona, it is mutter to cause tumah to chulin food in Eretz Yisrael. And Rashi explains, Ve'in botzrim Yisrael, you're not allowed to harvest together with a Jew, mishum degorim tumahu, because there you're causing tumah. V'afagav desvira lon hasha. Now, even though in the Mishnah Achrona we now hold that mutter ligrom tumah l'chulin, that you're allowed to cause tumah for chulin food, kidikatani seif, as it's going to say now at the end of the Brisa. Hani mili de ovet kochavim. That's true when you're working together with an ovet kochavim. That's when the food belongs to an ovet kochavim. Avol de Yisrael, but if you're talking about the food of a Yisrael, tevulim heim l'truma, so that food, there's an obligation to separate truma from that food, so it is tevel for truma. It's almost as if truma is within that food, just hasn't been separated yet. V'yasser ligrom tuma l'truma, and the problem over here is you're not allowed to cause tuma for truma, t'chsiv, as it's written in the pasuk, and Rashi seems to be understanding that this is a deoraisa issue, because it says, Vani hinei nosati l'chos mishmeres trumosai b'shtei trumos hakosam medaber. It says trumosai in plural. It's talking about two trumos, meaning even truma that has not yet been separated. Even when the food is in a state of tevel, you haven't actually separated the truma, but still there's an issue of causing tumah. The kol shekein shein darchen, and Rashi says when it says here you're not allowed to harvest the grapes with the Jew who works with tumah, who works with his produce and his tameh. So that's true in terms of harvesting, and it's certainly true in terms of treading on the grapes. Shedrichasan mitamosim, because it's the actual treading that actually makes them tameh, because now they're already in the wine press of this Jew whose wine press is tameh. U'misayeh de over avera, and that would be supporting somebody who is committing a sin, who is committing an aveira. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Ve'ino osa yayin nesach ad sheyered lebor. It's not yayin nesach until it goes down into the cistern, into the pit. And again, that's the Mishnah Rishona, that when it actually reaches the bore, it's considered to be wine as far as yayin nesach is concerned. But again, according to Rav Huna, it's when it starts to flow from the wine press, that already is the point when it's considered wine in terms of yayin nesach. And the Gemara continues and asks, and the Mesoras Hashas changes this to Vohatnan, but we learned in a Mishnah, this is a Mishnah in Maisros, it says yayin misha yekafe. It says that wine, we'll see Rashi in a moment, misha yekafe, but this is talking about at that point in time it is wine when it comes to Meiser, from the time of misha yekafe. And the assumption over here is that the halachas of when it's wine in terms of Meiser and the halachas of when it's wine in terms of yayin nesach are the same, and so that's the contradiction. Rashi explains, Yayin Misha Yekafe have a Gemar Melacha. From the time of Misha Yekafe, that's when it's considered to be finished. Le'inyan Meiser, in terms of Meiser, Le'yaser Bo Shasiyas Arai, that now it's forbidden to drink it in a temporary fashion. Rashi says, Misha Yekafe Lashon Saf. The word Misha Yekafe is a language of floating, Kemo Kafa Tehoma de Mesechet Sukkah, like we find in Mesechet Sukkah. Shet Safin Hachartsonim Al Hayayin Keshunach Bebor. What happened is the wine would flow into the bore, into the cistern, and then the pits, and maybe the grape skins as well, they would flow to the top and you would skim those off. That's what Misha Yakafa means. It means when those grape pits are floating to the top, that's the point in time when the wine is finished. So that's obviously after it has reached the pit. Meaning to say, in our mission, it says when it reaches the pit, when it reaches the cistern, that's when it's considered to be wine. But in the Mishnah in Meseches, it says you have to wait a little longer. It's only when the pits start to float up to the top that it's considered to be wine, and that is the contradiction. Again, there's an assumption over here that the halachas of Meiser and the halachas of Yayin Nesach are the same. And the Gemara continues and answers, Amar Rava. Rava says, Lokash, it's not difficult. Ha Rabbi Akiva, ha Rabbanan, it's a machlokas between Rabbi Akiva and the Rabbanan with regards to Meiser, and it would be the same machlokas with regards to Yayin Nesach. And again, the Mesoras Hashas changes this to Detanya, as we learned in a Braisa, Yayin Misha Yered Labor. According to the Tanakama, in terms of Meiser, it's considered wine when it descends into the pit. Rabbi Akiva Omer Misha Yakaf. Rabbi Akiva says when the pits are floating, that's when it's considered to be wine. So we see that it is in fact a machlokas tanoim. And the Gemara continues, they had the following question, Kipoi debor or Kipoi dechavis? What exactly does it mean, Misha Yakafen? Now, we just interpreted that to mean that it's floating in the pit, but the Gemara wants to clarify that. Does it mean that it's floating, the pits are floating in the pit? Or even later, there was another point in time where they would again have to make the wine more pure. They would again have the pits, anything that was remaining would float to the top in the chavis, in the barrel. So we want to clarify what exactly does Rabbi Akiva mean. And the Gemara says, Tashma, come in here the following proof again. The Mesoras Hashas changes this to Ditnan, as we learned in the Mishnah, and this is also the Mishnah in Maisros. It's a continuation of the same Mishnah above. Yayin Misha Yakafa, again it says the wine when it floats. Afal Pisha Kafa, and then the Mishnah goes on to say, and the Bach has a gears of Viafal Pisha Kafa, even though it's floating, Kolate Min Hagas Valyon, you're still allowed to take from the wine press, which is the upper area, Umin Hatzinor, and from the pipe where it's flowing, Veshos, and he can drink. Meaning to say, the Mishnah is essentially saying, and it's clear now that we're talking about floating in the bore, in the pit, because it's saying even though you have wine where the pits are floating to the top in the pit, but if you still have wine that is flowing from the wine press and through the pipe to the pit, so that you can still take wine from that area, even though the wine down by the pit is already ready in terms of Meiser, and it's obligated in Meiser, but you're still allowed to take from the wine that's up on top, again in the wine press and that's flowing through the pipe. And so it's clear that the word kafa over here, Misha Yakafa, is referring to the floating at the top, not in the barrels, but in the pit. And that's what the Gemara says. Shmamina kipoi debor ko amrinon. Shmamina. We see from here that we're talking about the floating of the pits to the top in the bore. And the Gemara says, indeed, we see that that is the case. And Rashi explains, V'afa pisha kafa, even though it's floating masha bebor, even though the pits are floating to the top in the pit, kolate he can take min hagas yona from the upper wine press v'shosa, he could drink it sha'oso shalo yarad labor, because the part that has not yet descended into the pit lo nigmar melachto, that's not a finished product. Min hatzinon, from the pipe, makom derech marzev hamekaleach yain labor, that's the pipe where it's flowing to the pit. And the Gemara continues and asks, V'hatani Rav Zavid b'divei Rabbi Yoshia, didn't Rav Zavid teach in the yeshiva of Rabbi Yoshia? He taught a different version of the above brisa, that the Tanakama says, yayin, it's considered wine, misha yered labor v'yakafa, from the point that it goes to the pit and it begins to float, that the pits begin to float to the top. Again, according to the version of the brisa we had above, the Tanakama simply said, yayin misha yered labor, wine from when it descends to the pit. Here the Tanakama is adding v'yakafa, it floats to the top, which actually sounds like what Rabbi Akiva said in the version above, because Rabbi Akiva Omer Misha Yakafa, from the time it floats. So the Tanakama here seems to be like Rabbi Akiva above. And then this brisa continues, this version continues, Rabbi Akiva Omer Misha Yishla Bechevios. Rabbi Akiva says Misha Yishla Bechevios, and Rashi explains what that means. First, b'devei Rabbi Oshia b'masnisa devei Rabbi Oshia. It refers to the brises of the yeshiva of Rabbi Oshia. And Misha Yishala Bechevios means Lashon Hashola Dagim Min Hayom. It's like somebody who takes fish from the sea. And what that means over here is Misha Yishala Hayayin Min Habor L'hinosin Bechevios. From the wine is taken from the pit and put into the barrels. It's from that point in time, when it's taken to the barrels, that it's considered to be wine, according to this version of Rabbi Akiva. And so we have a contradiction here in terms of the brises, in terms of what the Tanakama says, what Rabbi Akiva says, and the Gemara says, Tir tzanami lahach kamaisa hachi. We'll just answer that first brisa like this. We're going to change the first brisa, amend it as follows: Yayin mishayered labor v'yakafa. V'yakaf, according to the Tanakama, it's wine when it goes into the pit and the pits are floating to the top. The grape pits are floating to the top. Rabbi Akiva says, Mishiyashala b'chevios, from the time that it's taken from the pit and put into the barrels. And the Gemara continues, V'yala mas nisan. But then according to that, what about our Mishnah? In our Mishnah it says that it's yayin nesach when it goes down into the pit. Now if we're going to go with this version of the Brisa, so you have the Tanakama who says that it's in the pit and the pits of the wine are floating to the top. Rabbi Akiva says it's when it's in the barrels. And now our Mishnah is going to be a third opinion, where it's just when it simply goes down to the pit. Again, even if you had a Mishnah Achrona of Rav Huna, so that was just a change of what our Mishnah said slightly. Instead of when it goes into the pit, it's when it's flowing from the wine press into the pit. But still, that's like neither of the opinions that we're quoting in this revised brisa. And so the Gemara says, Leima tolosa tanoi. Let's say that there's a three-way machlokas tanoim, because the Mishnah says it's from when it's in the pit. Then we have another opinion from when the grape pits are floating over there, and then we have a third opinion of Rabbi Akiva from the time it goes to the barrels. So is this a three-way machlokas tanoim? And the Gemara says, Lo, no, shani yayin nesach tachmiru be'rabbanan. It could be, now the Gemara questions what it said above, it could be that yayin nesach is different and the rabbanan are stricter, meaning the Gemara is now suggesting that there is no comparison between when it's considered wine as far as meiser is concerned and when it's considered wine as far as yayin nesach. As far as yayin nesach, so then we'll say that it's wine the moment that it's in the pit, at sheyered labor. But when we're talking about the halachas of meisers, which is what the brisa is talking about, so there you have different opinions that are more lenient. It's mishayered labor via kafa or mishayishala bechevios. And Rashi explains, Elamas nisan de kotani ad sheyered labor. Again, our Mishnah which says it has to go down to the pit. Hayared labor, but meaning once it goes down to the pit, afal bishalo kifa, even though nothing is floating, haviyayin, it's considered wine. Name kiyechi de kotani linyan nesach hachanami sril linyan meiser. Again, let's say, as we've been assuming all along, that the halachas of nesach are the same as meiser. Upalagad the rabbanan vad Rabbi Akiva, and our Mishnah is a third opinion that argues on the rabbanan and Rabbi Akiva. Tolosa Tanoi, that would be a three-way machlokas Tanoim. Tana Didon Savra Mishayered Labor. Our Tana holds from when it goes down to the pit. Ul Rabbanan Mishayekafa Babor, according to the Rabbanan, when the grape pits are floating in the pit. Ul Rabbi Kiva Mishayeshalan, according to Rabbi Kiva, it's from when it's taken to the pit to the barrels. And again, the Gemara answered, Shani Yayin Nesach is different. Aval b'Meiser, Ikra Rabbanan, Ikra Rabbi Kiva. But it could be by Meiser. Again, it's different than Yayin Nesach by Meiser. And there we would follow either at the Rabbanan or Rabbi Akiva. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Nun Vav Amud Beis.